The voice cut through the courtroom like a blade. "Don't let that girl get near the ledger." It wasn't a whisper. It wasn't an echo. It was a command gravelly, male, and blasting through the courtroom's overhead speaker system just as the red light on the first national news camera flicked on. For a moment, the world seemed to stutter. Heads turned in unison. Reporters froze mid-sentence. Security stiffened. No one breathed. And yet, Jasmine Crockett didn't move. She didn't flinch, didn't speak, didn't blink. With perfect calm, she reached into the file she had prepared the night before, pulled out a printed transcript, and placed it on the edge of the judge's bench, facing the cameras, facing the crowd. Bold, underlined in highlighter. One name stood out on the page: Howard Argate Sand. That was the moment silence stopped being quiet. It became unbearable. Because this wasn't just a courtroom anymore. It had become a stage, a battlefield, a reckoning. The tension wasn't theatrical, it was surgical. The kind that cuts without making a sound. And Jasmine? She wasn't just another state prosecutor in a gray suit anymore. She was the reason everyone in that room forgot how to breathe. It didn't matter who had spoken through the speaker. It didn't matter how or why the feed had been hijacked. What mattered was what had just been said and who it was clearly meant for. Her. Don't let that girl get near the ledger. The girl. The ledger. The fear. This wasn't about a case anymore. This was about a secret someone had just failed to bury. A message slipped through the cracks and broadcasted to the world. And instead of shrinking, Jasmine Crockett had stepped into eye-toning the moment like it was hers all along. The cameras were rolling. The microphones were live. And in a single, deliberate move, Jasmine Crockett didn't just challenge the system. She dared it to speak back. 8 hours earlier, the courthouse didn't know it was about to become a battlefield. The Western District Federal Courthouse stood quiet, stoic in its marble and glass, echoing footsteps down polished halls like whispers of old verdicts. But there was something different about that morning. Not in the air, not in the weather in the building itself. As if the walls could feel what was coming. Jasmine Crockett walked through the front doors at exactly 8 a.m., her heels tapping out a steady rhythm across the stone. She wore a tailored charcoal gray suit, crisp, confident. Under one arm was a thick stack of documents case files stamped in red. State versus Charles Lawson, a real estate mogul, a man with friends in every high-rise and hand in every pocket. But Jasmine wasn't worried about Lawson. She was watching the bench. Judge Howard Gates sat perched like a hawk-black robe ironed, expression carved from stone, his cold eyes following her like she'd stepped into the wrong room. He didn't nod, didn't greet, didn't even acknowledge her role as lead state prosecutor. He glanced at his watch, then let his gaze crawl over her like she was late for an interview she didn't deserve. And Jasmine felt it, that quiet, calculated chill. Not from the air conditioning. From him. "You don't belong here," his stare said. She said nothing, took her seat without comment, but the message was already loud and clear. From the corner of her eye, she saw the national camera crews setting up 3 of them, locking in positions like they'd been told this case would matter. But it wasn't the cameras that made her stomach tighten. It was when an elderly black woman in the gallery was quietly asked to move. She clutched her handbag, shuffled aside, apologizing. The white man next to hers, sprawled across both seats, wasn't asked a thing. Jasmine saw it. Everyone else pretended not to. This wasn't about courtroom etiquette. It was about power, about who belonged and who didn't. And as Judge Gates tapped his gavel for silence, he didn't mention the case, didn't welcome the jury. His first words were a smirk wrapped in insult. "Let's just hope Miss Crockett doesn't turn this into a circus." There it was, the real trial. The one no one put on the docket. And Jasmine? She was already in the ring. Jasmine didn't react. Not to the insult, not to the chuckles that followed. She'd heard worse. But what chilled her wasn't the words, it was the smirk that came after, the ripple of quiet laughter from the defense table, the low scoff from the court clerk. A theater of power where the jokes were never funny, just warnings in disguise. Charles Lawson leaned back in his seat, amused, fingers laced over a gold watch that probably cost more than the average salary in the gallery. His attorney, a silver-haired charmer with more charm than ethics, leaned in with a whisper and a grin. They weren't worried. Not about the charges, not about the cameras. Because they knew something Jasmine already suspected. This courtroom wasn't neutral ground. It was a rigged game. The signs were everywhere. The bailiff didn't greet her. The clerk avoided eye contact. The court stenographer typed slower when she spoke. It wasn't hostility. It was a choreographed indifference. A performance of silence designed to rattle. She scanned the room. From the gallery, the looks weren't curious, they were calculating. Measured. Waiting. How long will she last? Will she break? Because Jasmine Crockett wasn't just a prosecutor today. She was a test of how far truth could walk into a place that had no intention of listening. She opened her file. Exhibit A. Clear, color-coded financial records showing public funds diverted into shell companies tied to Lawson. She'd worked on this for weeks, verifying every page, triple-checking every number. And just as she began to speak, Judge Gates leaned forward, chin resting on his hand like a king bored at court. "Let's move quickly, Miss Crockett. I'm not here for storytelling." The room laughed again. A court officer smirked. Someone in the gallery whispered, "Here we go." Her grip tightened. Her heart did not. She'd been here before on streets, in boardrooms, in hearings where the message was the same. You don't belong. You don't matter. But what they didn't know was that Jasmine Crockett didn't walk into fire to survive. She walked in to burn it clean. She glanced at the judge, then at Lawson, and calmly said, "Then I hope the next page keeps your attention, Your Honor." Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She let the evidence speak first. With a single motion, she slid a document onto the projector of the room, dimmed as the screen lit up in color. A reconciled financial report. $12.5 million allocated for redevelopment. $24.8 million spent. The overage? Traced directly to a shell company, thinly veiled behind a series of cutout firms, all of them tied to Charles Lawson. 3 federal agencies had reviewed it. All verified. All airtight. Page by page, Jasmine walked them through the Trail City contracts, transfers, receipts. Her voice was calm, steady, precise. Until the room shifted. Judge Gates leaned back in his chair, stretched his arms dramatically, then sighed loud and performative. "Figures," he said. "Not this again." He didn't even glance at the screen. He waved it off like someone brushing away a fly. And in that instant, the trial cracked. The court clerk chuckled under his breath. The bailiff shook his head. Lawson's attorney tapped his pen, amused. Jasmine froze not because she was intimidated, but because she recognized the playbook. Theatrics, mockery, delay. It was all part of the same game. Turn truth into noise. Turn fact into fiction. Make the room believe this wasn't real just numbers, just spreadsheets, just her imagination. She steadied herself. "This data," she said, "was verified by 3 independent federal agencies. All signatures are authentic. This isn't speculation. This is fact." Judge Gates chuckled, a slow, heavy laugh, like someone flipping the script mid-performance. "Very creative, Miss Crockett. Planning to write a financial thriller next?" The gallery tensed. Outside, the live stream exploded comments, tweets, news alerts. But inside the courtroom, silence. The kind that watches history happen. She didn't respond with anger. She didn't plead. Instead, Jasmine clicked to the next slide. The courtroom projector flickered, then locked in on a single name. Howard R. Gates. A judge's signature, dated 6 days before Lawson acquired the land, stamped next to an unauthorized $12.3 million transfer. She didn't look at the jury, didn't turn to the cameras. She pointed at the screen and asked just one question. "Your Honor, can you explain this?" Judge Gates didn't flinch. For a full second, the courtroom held its breath. The name on the screen, his name, glared down like a spotlight that couldn't be turned off. Everyone saw it. The signature wasn't in fine print. It wasn't hidden in a footnote. It sat front and center, next to the city seal, next to the number, $12.3 million. Jasmine didn't move. She didn't need to. Because in that moment, silence was louder than proof. Gates slowly leaned forward, hands folded, lips pursed, his face unreadable. Then he said it, forged. One word. Cold. Dismissive. Final. He didn't ask for verification, didn't question the evidence, didn't offer a shred of counterproof. He just declared it false. And the room froze. Not visibly, but internally. Everyone from the jury to the bailiff knew what they had just seen. But they also knew something else. If the judge says it's fake, it's supposed to be fake. Right? Jasmine stared at him, expression neutral, but her pulse pounded, not with fear, with fury held in check. Because this was the game, the old game, where power doesn't argue, it declares. Where evidence doesn't matter unless power allows it to matter. But Jasmine Crockett didn't walk into that courtroom for permission. She turned back to her files, quietly unlatched a red-sealed folder, and pulled out a small black flash drive. No words, no drama. She crossed to the media console and plugged it in. The screen flickered. A burst of static. Then, a voice raspy, male, unmistakable. Make sure that girl never gets near the ledger, you understand me? The room snapped silent. No chuckles now. No smirks. Just raw, electric stillness. A juror gasped. A reporter stopped typing mid-word. Even the defense attorney dropped his pen. Because the voice wasn't anonymous. It wasn't guesswork. It was him. Judge Howard R. Gates. Caught, recorded, exposed. Jasmine turned to the bench, voice calm, almost too soft. That recording was legally obtained with a federal warrant, verified by 3 independent audio forensic experts. Time-stamped 6 days before the transfer. She didn't blink, didn't smile, because this wasn't about revenge. It was about the moment truth stood up and power backed down. The voice echoed again, this time louder, clearer. Make sure that girl never gets near the ledger. There was no mistaking it. The rasp, the cadence, the authority soaked in arrogance. Judge Howard Gates. No speculation, no room for doubt. The courtroom wasn't silent, it was stunned, paralyzed. The man who had mocked the evidence was now undone by his own voice. Reporters stared, wide-eyed. A juror's hand covered her mouth. Even the camera crew slowly adjusted their lenses, as if uncertain whether to film or just watch history happen. And Jasmine? She didn't flinch. She stood tall, poised, as if she'd known this moment was coming all along. The recording, she repeated, was obtained under full federal warrant. 3 independent forensic labs authenticated the voice print. The date, 6 days before the illegal transfer. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Because the truth had already roared. Judge Gates's face drained of color, red to gray. Sweat beaded at his temples. His lips parted, then closed again. No witty retort, no contemptuous smirk, just silence. And that silence was damning. The courtroom door creaked open. 2 men entered, federal agents, dark suits, expressionless. One held a folded document in his hand. No words, just presence. They walked slowly, deliberately, down the center aisle. Every step, like thunder in a storm of disbelief. The gallery parted. Even the jurors leaned forward. The lead agent approached the bench, unfolded the warrant. His voice cut through the tension like a blade. Howard R. Gates, pursuant to orders from the U.S. Attorney General, you are hereby placed under arrest for obstruction of justice, abuse of judicial authority, and conspiracy to commit financial fraud. Gasps. Audible. Real. But no one interrupted. Not even Gates. He didn't stand, didn't protest, didn't blink. He was done. The cuffs snapped shut with a metallic click, cold and final. The robe still hung from his shoulders, but the power it once held was gone. He was no longer the judge. Just a man. A man in handcuffs. As the agents escorted him down the same aisle he once ruled from above, no one clapped. No one spoke. Even the court stenographer stopped typing. Because the trial wasn't over. It had just rewritten the meaning of justice. He was still sitting there. Charles Lawson, millionaire real estate mogul, the man who had smirked through every objection, who treated the courtroom like a personal boardroom, was now frozen in place. The cameras turned to him. So did the jury. So did Jasmine Crockett. For a moment he tried to keep it together, straightened his tie, adjusted his cufflinks, wiped his forehead with a silk handkerchief. But it wasn't working. His hands were shaking. The courtroom, still stunned from Gates' arrest, had shifted its weight. Now he was under the microscope. The predator in designer shoes had just realized he wasn't untouchable after all. Jasmine turned to her files once more. She picked up a document tome already entered into evidence and walked toward the defense table. Each step echoed like a countdown. She placed the file gently in front of him. It was the contract, the one showing the fund transfer, the one with Gates' signature. And right beside it, Lawson's Breit Vri. "You signed right here," she said, her voice like ice under pressure. "You really think you're walking out of this clean?" The room tensed. Lawson's attorney leaned in fast, whispering furiously. But the mogul didn't respond. His eyes were bouncing between Jasmine, the agents at the back of the room, and the cameras. This wasn't supposed to happen. This was his world. He funded campaigns, shook hands at ribbon cuttings, hosted fundraisers where judges sipped cocktails. And now he was sweating through imported silk. I want to cooperate," he stammered. "I'll talk. I'll give you everything." Jasmine didn't blink, didn't gloat. She simply opened her briefcase, pulled out a fresh deposition form, and slid it across the table. "Full names," she said. "No omissions." He nodded slowly, defeated, because the walls weren't just closing in. They were collapsing. And Jasmine Crockett wasn't just a prosecutor anymore. She was the reckoning they never saw coming. The cameras rolled. The jury leaned forward. And outside, across the country, millions of people were beginning to understand justice hadn't just been served. It had finally started fighting back. 1 week later, Jasmine Crockett stood at a podium in Washington, D.C. No robe, no camera crews rushing her, no courtroom stage. Just a black blazer, a silent chamber, and a nation still trying to catch its breath. Behind her, the American flag hung steady. In front of her, lawmakers sat frozen. Reporters gripped pens without writing. Survivors of injusticeism in suits, some in silence, filled the gallery. A mother who'd lost custody to a biased judge. A veteran denied compensation. A teacher who watched a colleague be silenced for speaking out. Jasmine didn't bring a script. This wasn't a speech. It was a reckoning. "I'm not here to celebrate an arrest," she said, voice low, firm, clear. "And I'm not here to claim victory. I'm here to say something uncomfortable." The room shifted. If a judge can sell justice from the bench, the failure isn't his alone. It belongs to every system that protected him, and to every silence that allowed it. No one interrupted, because there was nothing to argue. Not today. Her words weren't angry. They weren't political. They were surgical, and they cut in places no one wanted exposed. One senator leaned back, staring at the ceiling. Another lowered her head. In the front row, the mother who had been quiet now wept openly, no longer hiding the grief that had lived too long in shadows. Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her presence said everything. The battle wasn't just in courtrooms. It was in culture, in compliance, in every door we pretend is locked until someone kicks it open. "We can't call this a nation of laws if those who wear the robe get to write their own," she continued. "Justice isn't an idea, it's a fight, and it belongs to all of us now." Outside the chamber, thousands had gathered, some holding signs, others just watching. But in a small apartment on the south side of Chicago, a girl sat cross-legged on a worn carpet, eyes locked on the television screen. Her mother, still in nursing scrubs, stood behind her in silence. And then, in a whisper barely above breath, the girl said, "Mom, I want to be like her. It didn't go viral. It didn't trend. But it meant everything. Because justice didn't end in that courtroom. It had only just begun. The headlines kept rolling for weeks. Judge falls, prosecutor rises. Justice system shaken to its core. Who let him stay so long? But Jasmine Crockett didn't care for headlines. While the nation argued in living rooms and newsrooms, she returned to her office, same worn briefcase, same desk with a crooked nameplate, no victory tour, no press run, just stacks of cases still waiting. Because for her, this wasn't a climax. It was a beginning. Charles Lawson's deposition turned into indictments, 3 of them, one for a state treasurer, one for a private contractor, one for a former deputy mayor, all tied to the same scheme. One truth had cracked open a chain of lies. And across the country, people noticed. Law students printed her closing line and taped it above their dorm desks. Justice isn't an idea, it's a fight. In barbershops and cafes, they debated what it all meant, not just the case, but the courage. A judge had fallen. But more than that, a mask had fallen. And Jasmine? She never once called herself a hero. Because heroes wait for applause. She was something else. She was the proof that power could be held accountable and that someone, somewhere, could look the system in the eye and not blink. Back in Chicago, that little girl with the scrubs-wearing mother watched every update. She started writing in a notebook she titled My Casebook. Not fan fiction. Not dreams. Blueprints. Because the seed had been planted, and it would not die. In the Capitol, Jasmine was later asked to give a statement for a justice reform panel. She wore the same black blazer. Still no notes. She looked the committee in the eye. If you're looking for one broken judge, you missed the point, she said. He was a symptom. The silence around him, that was the disease. The room didn't clap. They listened. Because when Jasmine spoke, it wasn't about noise. It was about naming what we pretend not to see. And outside that chamber, on the steps where so many marched and gave up, a new sound began to rise. Not chanting, not cheering, just footsteps. Quiet, steady, determined, walking in the path Jasmine had carved. Because justice didn't wear a robe anymore. It wore resolve. Weeks passed. News cycles moved on. Another scandal, another election, another distraction. But in one corner of the country, something stayed. In classrooms, young students rewatched clips from that day in court. Jasmine's voice calm, the evidence irrefutable, the handcuffs final. In community centers, people played the audio aloud. Make sure that girl never gets near the ledger. And every time they heard it, they didn't hear fear anymore. They heard the end of impunity. In a law school in Atlanta, a young black woman stood before her peers and said, "I used to think the courtroom wasn't built for people like me. Then I saw Jasmine Crockett." In New Orleans, a retired judge quietly sent a donation anonymously to a fund helping law students from underserved communities. In Los Angeles, a group of teenagers launched a podcast called The Ledger, breaking down corruption cases and interviewing attorneys who once felt invisible. And in a quiet office in Washington, Jasmine Crockett sat alone. Her desk was still cluttered, her coffee still cold. But something had changed. Because across America, truth wasn't just being whispered anymore. It was walking. Jasmine looked out the window. The Capitol stood tall, but no longer untouchable. Not to her. Not to the people now watching every bench, every ruling, every voice that once went unheard. She didn't smile. She didn't pose. She just reached for another file. Because justice isn't a moment. It's a motion. It keeps going, or it dies. She knew this. And far from D.C., back in Chicago, that same little girl now with a shelf of notebooks full of legal scribblers stood in front of her school's speech contest. Her hands trembled, but her voice? Steady. "I want to tell you about someone who didn't shout to be heard." She made the world quiet down to listen. The crowd blinked. Some parents whispered, but the teacher in the back nodded. Because they all knew that girl wasn't just telling a story. She was answering a calling. And Jasmine? She wasn't watching from a screen. She was already deep in the next case. Because once truth finds a voice, it doesn't ask permission to speak again.